All right, so hi everyone, I'm Minji.
I'm Kim-Fi.
So we are co-chairing the seminar committee this academic year, and we're happy to welcome you to the first of the series. This year we have a very nice lineup of speakers ranging from mathematics, statistics, engineering, and computational biology being applied to a wide range of biological systems like cancer and immunology, etc. Please, we want to see participation from students. You can have lunch with speakers and ask lots of questions during seminar series. So we'll hand it over to Indika Rajapakse to introduce your first speaker.
Thank you. Thank you, Minji. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks all for coming. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mason Porter. And Mason is a professor in the Department of Mathematics at UCLA. And previously, he was a professor at nonlinear and complex systems at University of Oxford. Mason has so many papers, if you can check it out, like almost like 250 now. Good, close. And Mason is from Los Angeles, from LA, and he got his undergraduate at Caltech and then PhD at Cornell. And I know Mason for a long time now, but I'm so happy you are here, Mason.
Yeah,
and thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I think we're going to use this mic. Yeah, so Indika and I met when we met at the 2002 Dynamics Days conference in January, when we were both graduate students, both working on entirely different things than what we work on now, of course. Okay, so yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, yeah, especially if students have questions or postdocs have questions and you want to ask stuff, please do. Okay, so I'm going to talk about topological data analysis of spatial systems, and there'll be some different applications that arise, but I really want to kind of give the perspective of this and kind of how we're thinking about these problems. And so I'm going to have a lot of focus will be on the sort of background in case this is something that you might be interested in learning more about. Okay, so a topic from, so actually an interesting thing is I actually gave a version of this talk. I mean, some slides were different, but I gave a 1-hour math talk at the World Science Fiction Convention a month ago. I'm serious. So I actually modified this talk from the ones for the science fiction audience. And one of the things that was really cool from that is that there were literal parallel sessions during mine about time travel, right? That was actually literally true. Okay, anyway, so I hope that some of those slides I was giving to that general audience would also apply here, and then we'll see how it goes. So anyway, some mathematical underpinnings. So the subject of topology gives some of the mathematical underpinnings of some of these methodologies. And if you look at Wikipedia, and this is from a month ago when I was preparing this slide, so I can't promise that this text has changed, but this is what Wikipedia had to say. And so it's concerned with certain properties, and you're allowed to do some stuff to the space that you're in, or the object. So you can squish it, you can twist it, you can crumple it, you can bend it, but what you cannot do, you can't tear it, and you can't glue things together, okay? So there's certain things that you're allowed to do and certain things that you're not allowed to do. And we care about things, and this will come up later in slides, that we call invariants. What stuff changes, in particular, what stuff does not change when you're allowed to do certain things, okay? So that's the type of thing that you're gonna end up wanting to compute. So a very classical one is donuts and coffee cups. The picture on the left, there's a video version of this. So from Henry Segerman and Keenan Crane, these are sort of computational geometry sorts of folks. You can actually buy this sequence of things in various colors if you want to spend certain amounts of money to do it. I was curious enough to be tempted, and then I got to my senses before actually paying a couple $100 for these. But but a coffee cup can be transformed to a donut. And one of the things that happens is that the number of objects stays the same. It's always one object, so that's one component. And the number of holes, although eventually you have to start defining different types of holes, but the number of holes stays the same, and that's 1. So you can count the number of objects and say that there's one object, and you can count the number of holes and say there's one hole, and both the donut and the coffee cup satisfy this. And so this is a deformation that I'm allowed to do. And so a topologist, can't tell the difference in that sense, because the things that they're measuring are giving them the same number for both. Okay, so that's a sort of classical type of thing. Things can get a lot messier, like if you live at the border of Belgium and the Netherlands, and everything that's in yellow is in Belgium, and everything that's in the Netherlands is in beige. And as an exercise, you can go there and turn on your GPS and see what country it's in, and your country will be like Belgium, Netherlands, Belgium, Netherlands, Belgium, Netherlands. And so you have this complicated structure. And of course, I'm showing you this one because it's an extreme example. But the thing is, when you're dealing, say, with geospatial data, like if you're looking at something like, say, spread of COVID over certain regions of New York City, which is something that we have looked at. I've actually took those slides out, but there's a paper where we've looked at that. You actually have to worry about the boundaries of different regions that are not trivial topologically. And we literally have cases of theorems because of areas of New York City in that paper. Okay, but anyway, so this is an extreme example, but if you're dealing with geospatial data, you're not just having a bunch of blocks. You have to actually deal with some complicated topology sometimes. Now, a particular type of topology or subfield of topology that shows up a lot in topological data analysis is known as algebraic topology. So this is the Wikipedia entry as about a month ago. And this is the one that's going to really be talking about invariance. And so it gets things from algebra. When I was talking about the number of components, the number of pieces, this is going to correspond to an algebraic object and its dimension, which has that number of pieces. And the number of holes is going to correspond to an algebraic object that has that number of pieces. And so this is where ideas from algebra are going to get combined. Now, as is common in applied math, we don't need all of algebraic topology or all of like a graduate course in algebraic topology to do it, because we're going to take chapter 1 of one of those books and get a lot of mileage out of it, because that's what we often do in applied mathematics. And if you ask me about chapter 2, I'm going to tell you I have no idea how any of that stuff works, because you learn what you need to learn. Okay. So again, the key idea, I said it verbally, but you want to describe the properties of an object that stay the same. You're allowed to do certain things. You can stretch it or shrink it or bend it, but you can't glue and you can't tear. And so we seek topological invariance. What things can we count that don't change under the deformations that we're allowed? And other people could do different things and allow different sets of deformations. So you can have different types of invariance. Okay. So there's number of components, number of holes, technically number of holes in different dimensions. So for instance, the hole that's shown here is not the same as a void inside a spherical shell, right? So I'd actually count those differently. This is a 1 hole, that would be a 2 hole. So you worry about holes with different dimensionalities. That's something that you do have to care about. So the word hole has to get abstracted a bit. And we're going to be looking at what's called homological invariance, which, well, homological is really saying number of holes. And components are 0-dimensional holes. But there's other types of invariance as well. These types of invariance have known properties of being able to compute them quickly. And so that's one reason why this particular type of topological data analysis has expanded. It's called persistent. There's some echo here. Okay. Okay, sorry, that was distracting. The voice from the ether above not liking what I just said. Okay, so there are other types of invariance, and one of the advances that is useful to do, but is maybe there's less work on, or there is less work on, is trying to find good ways of computing other types of invariance. So instead of just saying stretching or shrinking or whatever, but some other thing you're allowed to do, and getting good ways to do that. Okay. So we want to do the data. So what I showed you was not based on data, but was based on sort of, what would I see intuitively in a textbook. Okay, so we want to use those sorts of ideas, that sort of perspective, to say something about data. And that's a long tradition. So I might give you something like this. This is my spirit Pokemon, Jigglypuff. Technically indignant Jigglypuff is my spirit Pokemon. But even whether or not you recognize this character, we're good at filling in these dots, right? We're good. We see these dots and we're good at saying, oh, there are eyes and there are ears and other things, right? Humans are good at this. What we want is to do something like this algorithmically. And in particular, we're going to get a data set where we don't know the answer in advance, because if we could only solve problems where we know the answer in advance, then, well, why would we bother doing this? Okay, so this is one form data might take, or might be an image or a network or whatever. And so we want to study the shape of data, and I put shape in quotes. Topology is about studying shapes of things. We have to make sense what it means to do that. right? So this is what the sort of the key thing I'm trying to build up for today. And then I wanted to give some examples of what I do. So algebraic methods to study the topology of data in some kind of systematic manner. And the data could be a set of points in space. That's what a point cloud is. Could be images, could be networks, could be videos, although that's going to get computationally intensive. And the type of topological data analysis that is most common is known as persistent homology. So homology has to do with counting holes, and persistent, which I have to explain what that is. I mean, the English word is going to be very, I guess, helpful for that, but it has to do with features that exist over large sets of parameter values because you want to distinguish features from noise. And so this has algorithms that are fast enough to do this reasonably in certain cases, although fast is a subjective word that depends on the field. And there are formalisms for doing this. Okay, so this is kind of where we're going. There are various applications. For partly accidental reasons, there's been a lot of applications of TDA in neuroscience. And there's been enough that there are actually multiple review articles of TDA specifically in neuroscience. There's been work on things like vascular networks, a little bit of stuff on spreading processes. There's been a bunch of work on networks in general. There's been a bunch of work on granular materials, one of my favorite types of materials because it lets me have this. This is coffee. Okay. Resource coverage, which is an example I'll give you spend a little bit of time on. Detecting political islands, give you a little bit of time on, spend a little time on that. Structure of city streets and so on. So there's been a bunch of stuff. Okay, some references. I know this slide's a little bit text heavy, but in case people are interested in this, a few of us wrote an article in Physics Today. So this is geared towards undergraduate physicists about the topology of data. So you could take a look at that if you're interested. If you want a more complicated introduction that is also in this case written for physicists, Gunnar Carlson, who's one of the well-known kind of giants of the field, wrote something for Nature Reviews Physics a few years ago. This paper by Anne Sizemore et al. Is one of the examples of a review article on on doing TDA for neuroscience. There's a couple other ones. I purposely wrote this one down because this is the one that I like the best of those. If you want to get started in terms of actually even installing software and just doing persistent homology for the first time, Nina Otter and I and various other co-authors wrote a paper to do that. And that is literally meant for people who I am now going to do this for the first time. What should I do? And what comparisons are out there? So if you actually want to try doing it, then this last one is hopefully a helpful place to start. And then I'm happy to post slides and all that. So don't worry about if you miss a slide now, I'm happy to do that. Okay, so one example of resource coverage is if you're tired after a long day and want to get something to drink, maybe you want a pub nearby. So this is an example that was in a paper that was actually a review article / perspective piece of doing TDA for geospatial sciences, for geographic information sciences. And they had this example that I wish I thought of, okay, let's do pubs as resource coverage. So that's one of the examples in their paper. And this is just pictures here. So Manchester seems to be doing much better than Cardiff, at least visually. I don't know if that's what happens mathematically. Okay, this is one from a former master's student who I co-mentored who just started her faculty position. I forgot where in Germany last week. So she got her PhD with Heather Harrington. So this is Bernadette Stoltz and company, who's done a bunch of work on various types of vascular networks and applications of tumors. And so you could look up some of her stuff. This is just a pipeline picture from one of her papers. And my goal here is just to sort of illustrate stuff that people have done. I'm not going to be able to, I'm not going to be able to explain this figure in any reasonable way as far as my own knowledge is concerned, but this is just to see some example of stuff they've done if you want to look it up. Granular materials I have spent some time on. This picture is from quasi 2D photorefractive discs. There are two sizes, though it may be hard to see, and they get these things called granular force chains, which are the brighter ones means there's more forces, and you care about things like what are the sizes of the different size distributions of stuff in between and so on. And because things like contacts are so important, both network methods and topological methods have been very useful for it. There's a review article that I co-authored with various others on doing network analysis, and there are sections in there on doing topological data analysis. So if you're interested in these sorts of approaches on that family of problems, there's a specific section of our review article that you could start from. And there are a number of people who have been doing TDA on granular materials, and that's actually part of how I got into this in the first place. I have not done TDA on granular materials, but there was a sort of collaboration that started from that commonality of looking at granular materials. This is a paper from Dane Taylor et al. That I'm also involved in on spreading processes on networks, where we took a model from network science known as the Watts threshold model, and we were trying to look at when did something go around this circle, and when did something jump? And so we were trying to, in our way, if we found the circle topology in some data analysis we did, that was an indication that more things were going around a circle. So this is, again, I'm just showing this to give an example of types of things that we have thought about. One of them, another one, well, I'll be talking about a different part of this particular paper later today, but one thing that a couple of us looked at, my former student Michelle Fung and I looked at this, was city-street networks, and we did a bit of a classification, and you can ask if this classification of what the streets look like gives you something that sort of complements or is consistent with other ways of looking at city-street classifications. So Los Angeles is a bit boring here. This is center maybe 2 kilometers by 2 kilometers, but some of them are interrupted grids and others are not grid-like, sometimes because there's just very sparse and other times because weird stuff is going on. These things on the bottom I haven't explained yet, and I will explain those, so don't worry about them right now, but just the idea is to say I get some object from this topological analysis for each city, technically a 2 kilometer by 2 kilometer center of each city. And so then I can cluster different ones together, and I can say from this approach, which city streets are similar and which are not, and compare it to other approaches and see how we do, right? So that's using it as a classification problem. Okay, so that was to give an idea of various things that I and others have thought about, but now let's kind of go back up a little bit and do a little bit more math. I'll try to be friendly about it. I think I'm friendly about it. Okay, so I've shown you this picture before. We squinted this, what does it look like? Okay, well, this was something that we created from this figure, right? We're not going to do things like the colors, but there's a key similarity. And so you can look at this. So this picture, by the way, we wrote a paper on TDA for teens and preteens, and we published it in Frontiers for Young Minds. So if you have a child who is in high school and wants to learn about TDA, this is the paper to send them. But there are parts of it that are also helpful for broader audiences. This was a very challenging paper to write, I have to say, because usually you assume linear algebra, and obviously you're not going to be able to assume that. Okay, so panel A is the panel I showed you earlier. And what we do is that we take each of those dots. Now, a point cloud literally would have 0-dimensional dots, but to draw it, we have to have some finite radius. And we take the dots at the same points and we increase the radius. So B has larger radius than A, and C in turn has larger radius, and D in turn has larger radius, and so on. And what you see visually is that first the structures start getting more coherent, and then eventually they start getting less coherent, right? Eventually it's one blob. So the number of holes is changing, 1D holes, and the number of pieces is changing. Now the number of pieces always goes down, or well, goes down or stays the same. The number of holes goes up and then goes down, okay? And what you're able to do in terms of making sense of the topology of data is that I can take object A and I can count the number of pieces and holes. So I can measure the topology of A. And I can take object B and independently count the number of pieces and number of holes, piece and component of the same, by the way, of B. And I can continue doing this for each one of these. And I want features that are persistent in the sense of, for lots of values of the radius of this dot, that's going to be called a filtration parameter. For lots of values of this radius, I have the feature persisting. It is there for many things. But so to make sense of topology of data, I have to fix this radius or fix some other parameter and measure the topology. And that's how you go from data to something that's continuous. And then the persistence is that there are certain mathematical guarantees of what you're allowed to do in certain scenarios. And when people do forefront stuff on some methodologies, it's that they have lost that guarantee for some reason. Yes, please. Well, so the notion of continuity just means I have a space in which I'm allowed to do stuff. And so it just says within a given piece, it's continuous, but I'm counting the number of pieces. Thank you for the question. It's just that, so the reason I was making the comment about continuous, so maybe I should say something to try to make sure I'm clear on that, is that if I have a donut and a coffee cup, I mean, I'm sort of doing classical topology, and I have to have, if I just have a data set, it'd be like, what does it mean to have a hole in a data set? And what I'm trying to do is answer the question of what does it even mean to have a hole in a data set? And that's why I have this sequence of stuff. So that was why I made my prior comments. No, but I'm glad you asked the question, though, because it makes me feel like I was not as clear as what I should have been in terms of how I phrased it. Okay, so this is a summary of the table. The number of components, number of pieces is H naught. This is zero-dimensional holes. It's what are called Betty numbers. We didn't use the term Betty numbers in the paper, of course, or in this paper. And H1, 1D holes. And so this is just a counting of the number of pieces. So this is the same figures as before with the blob doing that. And then, so we do some count, and the pieces has to go down, cannot go up by construction. And the number of holes starts at 0, but humans are good at this. 2, the 2 is actually may not be the 2 eyes, depending on what's actually connected. 6, and so on, right? And then by the time you get to a blob, okay, something was there before, but if I only give you that blob, who knows? Okay, so we want algorithmic methods to study potentially high-dimensional data. This was not high-dimensional. In a quantitative manner. The data can come from point clouds, which is what happens here. Networks, images, could come from time series. There are people who do this for different types of time series analysis. And so the shape of data is this counting of pieces and holes and higher dimensional holes as you change some parameter. And so persistent homology is the type of TDA that does that. And this is for a certain type of invariant which counts holes. There are other types of TDA that use different invariants, and those are less developed, partly because there are some mathematical guarantees that are here but not there, or at least not there yet. And there are known faster algorithms for this type of invariant. So there are people who do like homotopy, which is deforming of curves, for instance, and try to do a version of analysis with deforming of curves, right? So there do exist other things, but when most people say topological data analysis, they are probably doing persistent homology. Okay, so I'm doing a little bit of a backup. So I need the notion of simplicial complex. I did actually still show this slide to the science fiction crowd. I was still okay. A K-simplex is a K-dimensional polytope that's a convex hull of its K+1 vertices. So I might have a point, an edge, a triangle, a tetrahedron, and so on. Okay, so those are things I care about. The faces will be of whatever dimension. So the tetrahedron, of course, has faces that are triangles, but its edges are also faces. It's just that those are lower dimensional faces. Okay, so I'm going to actually put the M on the faces because I care about all the lower dimensional ones as well. A simplicial complex is going to be a set of these things that satisfies 2 rules that I need. And one is a downward closure rule. That every face of a simplex of S is also in my complex. So if my tetrahedron's in my complex, this triangle has to also be in my complex, is what that is saying. And then a non-empty intersection has to be a face of both. And so what that means, and okay, what that means is that I cannot have 2 edges that are partly overlapping. They can completely overlap, or they can intersect at a point, or they cannot intersect. They cannot partly overlap. That's what's not allowed. So this is a picture from Wikipedia that shows up in a lot of these talks and some papers of a simplicial complex. And so here these edges are overlapping, but if I shifted this triangle, it would not be allowed, okay? So I can build these things together, and this is something of what it might look like. And when we are changing one of these parameters, the idea is that this particular object, a simplicial complex, will change as a function of, well, we had epsilon, which was, I didn't call it epsilon before. Okay, it's epsilon now. The radius of the dots, right? Or a function of something else. And when we're developing some methods and for a problem that we're interested in, it might not literally be the radius of a dot that's changing. It might be something else that's changing. But as a function of some parameter that you're controlling, this simplicial complex is changing. And so the set of things that you're studying is a set of all of these at once. Okay, persistent homology. So use ideas from algebraic topology, from chapter 1 of algebraic topology, to analyze data. Okay, I actually did show this slide at the science fiction convention as well, but I told them not to worry too much. So the concept that we have of having the collection of all of these is known as a filtered simplicial complex, sometimes just called a filtration. So the radius of these dots would be called a filtration parameter. And this is a sequence. So S naught would be the set of dots, actually with 0 radius, and Sn would be the blob. And these all would be the ones in between. And so we think of each of these as looking at a data set at a different scale. So the dots increasing in radius in our example. And we ask a question of which structures exist. So S naught is, I measure the topology of S naught. I measure the topology of S1. I measure the topology of S2. So I therefore count the number of holes and pieces and whatever of S1, count the number of holes and pieces and whatever of S2, and I ask which ones persist. And not just the counting, but in principle, also the actual holes, so there can be some trickiness there. Okay, so we want things that exist across a range of values because probably I cannot justify a specific value of epsilon as being the right value. And so I want a lot of values over which they exist to hopefully find a feature of the data rather than noise. That's odd. Okay, well, that was not left intentionally blank. I'm not sure what's happening there. That's really weird. All right, I don't know what happened there. Anyway, so this is a picture of what we're doing. So the K's here are the S's from before. This slide comes from one of my former students, from Abby Hickok. So we have K, R naught. So we think of these as the dots of a certain radius. And we have this, this nestedness. The nestedness, what the nestedness means is that the simplicial complex K R naught is contained in the simplicial complex, this one. So I'm required to have this nestedness property. That's actually one of the things that gives me a guarantee that allows me to do certain things. And some of the generalizations that people study. So if I have something that is both growing and shrinking, I lose some mathematical guarantees and have to work harder at certain things. Okay, so there's this nestedness in here that's actually important for what we do. So we have the dots. We have the radii around the dots, and we look at whenever two pairs. So I have 2 pairs of dots where the circles overlap. So I draw an edge between them. Here I have 3 dots where all of them mutually overlap. So I draw a triangle. I increase the radius further. I have 4 things where all the dots overlap. And so I have a tetrahedron. Okay, so you look at how many mutually overlap, and that's how you go from the blob with the dots around it, or the point cloud with the dots around it, to a simplicial complex. Okay, and this simplicial complex here is a subset of the one here, and that is by construction. That has to be true. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so what we did actually has a name. And the name is the Viatorth-Rips filtration. And so this term also does not show up in the paper for teens and preteens, but this is what we did. We fixed a radius. And for each point in the point cloud, we centered a ball of that radius on it. And so K plus 1 of these balls overlapping pairwise would mean that we construct a K simplex. And then the resulting collection of them is this whole object. So this thing here is one object. And then we increment epsilon and do steps again. Now, I say increment epsilon. I may have to worry about how much I increment epsilon, right? That's some choice that I might have to make and have to worry about. But we do this, and once we get a giant blob, we stop. In this example. Okay, so I didn't use these words before, but I use things like them, and these are things that we care about, and this is the birth and death of features. Yes, please. That is possible. So this is a good question. So yeah, let me comment on that. There's actually something called the check filtration in which I track that, and then combinatorially that will then lead to very expensive computations. And so this one here, this particular choice of only doing pairwise is exactly an approximation that can get that one wrong. There are some nestedness theorems, something that actually guarantee that if I increase the value of epsilon, I have it will be one type of filtration with a certain value of epsilon kind of sandwiched by another. So there's some theoretical guarantees that will say this will only get things wrong by a certain amount. But this is an approximation that is specifically made because computationally not doing it will run into trouble quickly. But yes, that is correct. But so check filtration is the one where you don't make that approximation. Viatorth-Rips filtration is the one where you do make that approximation. Okay. So the birth and death of features. So the terminology is fairly intuitive, which is good. Math does not always succeed in that when it chooses terminology. A feature is born at a certain resolution, certain value of epsilon in this example, if it is the smallest value where it exists. So a hole suddenly exists, it was born there. A feature dies if it's the largest value in which a feature exists. I know it's very professional to munch a cookie into the microphone when you give your talk. I am known for my professionalism, as people who know me know. Some features live forever. So there are ways of saying, I track things as long as I could, the feature didn't die yet. That does happen in practice. One does have to worry about that. And then there's various ways to summarize it. I'm going to show two just because those show up in a couple of different things that I did, but there's others as well. This one's called a barcode. So you have a barcode for each dimension. So this is the barcode for a number of components. This is the barcode for a number of pieces. And we are tracking when things are born and when they die. Epsilon, I think here actually might mean something else, but we're tracking some parameter. So it's analogous to the radius of those dots. And so each feature was born at a certain point and dies at a certain point. And it's called a barcode because of its resemblance to barcodes. And visually, longer features are more persistent. And the sort of hope, though there's some caveats to this, is that longer features are the ones that should be actual features of your data, and shorter features should be noise. There's actually strong caveats to that. Another one that we've used more recently, or sorry, more frequently in subsequent papers, I think, is persistence diagrams. So you have the birth on the horizontal axis, the death on the vertical axis. There was one slide earlier where I showed this, but said I was going to explain it later. So the diagonal line, diagonal is the word I want, would say that something's born and dies at the same time. So these pink circles are saying this one says I was born at 1 and I died at 2, I suppose it was. And so everything, all the pieces were born at the same time in this imaginary example, but the wholes were born at different times and they die at certain times as well. So the way this is plotted, you cannot have anything below the diagonal line. That is a choice. There are versions of this that have that differently. This top vertical line, those are the features that live forever. So it says, I've only tracked up to whatever time, and this feature has not died yet, so I'm just going to put it here and say it's lived forever, okay? Persistence diagrams, there is a notion of a distance between different persistence diagrams, and it's a little more convenient than for barcodes. So I'm just going to state that and not go into the math, and I'd have to probably look it up to make sure I remind myself to do the math correctly anyway. But if I have persistence diagrams as an output of something, so there's both a persistence diagram for pieces and for wholes, or for higher dimensional ones if you're tracking them, you can then put those into clustering algorithms, and this is what we did with the cities, that because we were allowed to measure a distance between different persistence diagrams, we now have a distance matrix and can cluster it in whatever way we want. Because like a good network scientist, I turn everything into a community detection problem. Okay, so I want to give a little bit of a couple examples, just to some stuff I've thought about. But my main focus was the sort of approach, because there's different problems people study, and those might be interesting. So one of them was published a few years ago now, and we were trying to look at political islands. So islands of red and a sea of blue, or light blue voters and a sea of dark blue, and we are good at doing that as humans, but we want an algorithm to do it. And one of the things that arises is that the constructions that I showed you were very heavily dependent on distance. But if you look at different precincts, so this is precinct level data that the LA Times collected for a project a few years ago, the number of papers that I've gotten on topics related to the 2016 election makes me feel like an ambulance chaser in terms of what happened. And then I wrote stuff. So anyway, but this is large, and I'm not trying to detect how large this is. I really care about who voted for whom. So in this case, darker blue is more Clinton, and darker red that looks orange for accidental reasons is more Trump. And so I don't care, though, that this is geographically large, this one piece. I care about the relative numbers of people who voted, right? And I had a construction that used distance, and so that actually would be a problem here. Okay, so precinct level voting data. Let me just, since there's time is an issue, and I wanted to talk about other things too. We constructed a couple different simplicial complexes. One of them was based on adjacencies, and I believe that we used queen adjacency, if I remember correctly. There's also rook adjacency. And so we said, okay, well, if n+1 nodes are all pairwise adjacent, then we're going to have an n-cyclic. So we don't care about the radius of a dot. Now we're actually looking at some notion of network adjacency to construct things. And then given appropriate node data or edge data, we constructed filtration in the sense of I can keep all of the precincts that voted at least 95% for Clinton, put dots there, connect those. And then I could keep all the precincts that voted at least 90% for Clinton. So now I have a superset of that and connect all those. Okay, so we gradually loosen how much of a lead we demand, and that's how we do our filtration. And so the percentage that voted for a certain candidate is playing the role of the radius of the dots in the prior example. Okay, so that's how we did that. And we had another construction that we also used. And since I'm at UCLA in the applied math group, of course, we've got to use the level set method at some point. Stan Osher was down the hall, so of course we had to use the level set method at some point. And what we did is that we had the data in a surface format, and we kind of had an initial condition, and we evolved the level set equations, and we looked at how that evolved. And so our parameter that plays this role of epsilon was actually time. Okay, by the way, this is a slide I did not show the science fiction people, because you can see I'm getting a bit more technical here. But we started things, we actually had a manifold as an initial condition. So we had a surface as an initial condition, we evolved it in time, and we saw what holes filled and when they filled. Okay, I know I'm doing that too quickly to understand the details, but hopefully I'm giving some of the intuition. The reason this works in terms of having a nestedness is this is a front propagation. If I change this PDE to something that did not have a strict propagation, then I would lose this nestedness that I've said I've needed, but have not told you why I needed. So you can do different constructions. Alpha is a further approximation of Viator strips, and I have not told you how alpha works. You do different constructions and you get different diagrams, and you can ask which ones work better. And here I'm just kind of showing you the fact that they're different. Adjacency was the one that we thought would work better in terms of our intuition and how we constructed it. The level set one was the one that actually worked better. And what worked better means was getting the islands, getting more of the islands, having more true positives and less false negatives, basically. So here we're getting islands that are actually corresponding to islands. Here we are actually getting some, but imperfectly. And here we're getting some, but even less good. And the distance, the sort of physical distance here was getting in the way. Okay, so I haven't explained it fully, but I've given you hopefully some intuition. Okay, we're not going to do this talk without doing spiders on drugs, because can't do that. So this is another example from this 2020 paper. By the way, the 2021 paper actually comes before the 2020 paper, but the publishing speed in applied math is slower than physics, and so they came out in the published version in the reverse order. But if you care about the methods, the 2021 paper is the one that actually comes first. It happens. Okay, so NASA is involved in this story. But the story goes back to 1940s, and there's a Swiss pharmacologist, Peter N. Witt, whose friend did not like the fact that spiders were spinning webs at 2 in the morning and waking him up. I don't know why that would be loud, but anyway, that was part of the story. And he told his friend, hey, you're a pharmacologist, can you do something? So being a pharmacologist in the mid-20th century, what did he do? He gave drugs to animals and saw what happens. And so there were different webs of different drugs given to spiders, and just looking at the structure of the webs. And then there's this tech brief. It's only like a 2-page tech brief, so you could read it in a couple minutes. So in the Marshall Space Flight Center studied the webs of spiders that were exposed to various chemicals and did some basic statistics and so on, showed a couple pictures. So some of these are images that come from WIT, and some of them are images that come from NASA. We have a couple others, and I don't remember which is which, so we only have 7 of these things. I'm guessing, though they do not actually say this in the tech brief, that they maybe wanted to have something that, non-primate animals or so on, is my guess. Or maybe they wanted to create Spider-Man, I don't know. So you've got the drug-free one, which looks pretty good. You've got caffeine spider. Everyone likes caffeine spider. And at this point, I'm going to sip my coffee. Cheers. I will be spinning some strange spider webs later. The marijuana spider does okay. Speed spider, I suppose, does okay. Chloral hydrate runs into all sorts of trouble. And in case you're wondering, chloral hydrate is one of the things they put in sleeping pills. I mean, I'm not trying to give you a positive outlook on life with this thing. Okay, so we were like, okay, here are these cool pictures, these cool images. Image data is something that you're allowed to do. Let's have that as an input. Do the level set filtration. So you start this initial condition in the empty spots and just fill it in and see what happens. And you get some stuff that admittedly is a little bit hard to read, but you get 7 different persistence diagrams. And I am allowed to construct a distance between them so I can cluster them. And I know normally you would not bother clustering 7 things because that's not, you really cluster many things like a couple hundred city streets, which is also in that paper. But this example is fun. So the drug-free spider is on its own. If you, this is a dendrogram, and speed and chlorhydrin and caffeine are over here. And these are the 3 that looked not so good, and marijuana, peyote, and LSD are there. Okay, so again, you don't really classify 7 things. And I should also say another example that we did in that paper, and it's one where the method we have is not good enough because we're not picking up some of the stuff we need, is classification of snowflakes. We only use 12 images, but people who study snowflakes, so Ken Lebrecht from Caltech is a good example of this, they do care about classifying different types of snowflakes and finding different types of bifurcation diagrams. You would need to change the construction from how we did it to do it well. And what ends up happening, and this is sort of our example that didn't work one in the paper, just to illustrate there's more stuff to do with the methods, the 6-fold symmetry was overriding everything else is what was happening. So that one needs to somehow take that into account in designing the methods. So you can, but in principle, you can use this on classification problems that people actually do. But the spider example is fun. And this is the one I always show in the talks because everyone loves caffeine spider. Okay, so I also want to talk about another one. And this is from the final version of this particular paper, came out a month ago. And this is on resource coverage. So I showed an example with pubs. So now you have a bunch of stuff that is somewhere on a map. You do have to worry about things like city streets and travel time versus travel distance and so on. This project started as a class project. I had a special topics class on math and social systems where the sort of requirement had to be somewhere in that intersection. It could be pure math and doing proving theorems that are fun, that are motivated by it, or it could be even advocacy stuff. And so one of them eventually led to a paper that was published in final form a month ago. So let's see. Actually, yeah, now all these people now either have jobs or have jobs waiting for them. That was not even true a couple weeks ago, so that's good. Okay, so naive approach versus pH approach. And I mean, pH is not the only non-naive approach. I should make that clear. But one of the things that is often done, and there's actually some actual legislation that people have had that. So Joe Biden once said, okay, everybody should be within 5 miles of a polling site to be able to vote. And was suggesting that as a rule. Now, there's actually a lot of problems with that because for one thing, 5 miles here in Ann Arbor is not the same as 5 miles in Los Angeles if you're talking about how long it takes to get there, right? So first of all, distance is not the right thing that you should be measuring. So the rule should not be based on distance. That's number one. Number two, hopefully based on examples that I've shown, just saying some arbitrary threshold, D equals 5, is probably not the way you want to do this. You want to look at what happens for different values and see how things move, right? So not only should your distance be measured in a way that's appropriate, but you should also have a flexibility. Again, pH is not the only way to do this, but it is a type of approach that is built towards that perspective. I have what, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, a couple minutes. Okay. So 5 or anyway. So you might calculate the percentage of people that live within a certain distance, having fixed the distance of whatever, or calculate which locations are within a certain distance, right? But there's distance and there's fixing. So we can do all scales at once. So that's a nice feature of this. And we can identify entire zones that are not covered rather than doing point-wise, which can sometimes be good, especially if there's sort of demographic features of those zones. Unsurprisingly, if you look at the data, there are people of certain demographics who are systematically, I think the technical word is screwed over. I was going to sugarcoat it a little bit, but I mean, honestly, that is what it is. Okay. I'll be careful if I give this talk in Texas. Okay, so let's measure distance in terms of time. So I'm putting distance in quotes. There's a couple types of distance. There's distance as literal geographic distance, and there's distance in a more mathematical sense. It doesn't necessarily have to be the strictest version of, it doesn't have to be a metric. So I don't have to satisfy every property as a mathematical metric, but I need something that is distance-like, and time is a good one for voting. And in particular, there's two components that we use of time. Travel time and waiting time. There is going to be a big issue of data that we can get and data that we can trust and how much that costs. So that can be a big deal. But we're going to say, okay, we are, say, somewhere, living somewhere, working somewhere. We go to the polling site. We wait in line, possibly a long time. We vote, we go back, right? This is how much there's there. And we also have to worry about things like different modes of transportation, and this is going to be different across cities. So it might be that in a certain zip code, 70% of the people have cars, so those people can use cars, we assume, and others don't. So they might have to use a bus or they might have to walk, right? Okay, so there's going to be various data cleaning and choices there that have all sorts of warts in them that one has to worry about. This paper should be viewed as a proof of concept because we were willing to spend a few $100s for data, and the API, for Google, if you really wanted very rich, finely grained detail, would have been more like a few $100,000. Okay, so fidelity of data and data sources does creep in this very seriously. And we're worrying about waiting times. That wouldn't be true for all applications, but it is true here. What that means in the context of what I showed you, remember I was showing balls of certain radii expanding. If I have to wait an hour, what I do at a certain place is I wait an hour, and only after an hour do I expand the ball. If at another place I'm waiting 2 hours, I wait 2 hours, and then I expand the ball. So you have this amount of time that the ball is not expanding till the waiting time. So this is known as a weighted Vietoris-Rips filtration. So it's a modified version of the example that I first showed you. We used some, so our waiting times were at the level of congressional districts, not individual precincts, right? So we assumed each precinct was the same because this is the data that we were able to get. This is not a correct assumption, but this is the data we were able to get. And the estimate, there's a certain paper that did this. And so we were using data from that paper. Okay. And to give, we did 6 cities. Technically, LA County was one of our cities. We were motivated initially by Atlanta. Stacey Abrams was kind of was talking about that back in the day. And then the second city that we thought about was actually New York City because of its public transportation. So we felt it would probably be a lot better than Atlanta. So one particular figure in there is Atlanta versus Chicago. And what we're showing is the death time on the horizontal axis. So this is when either a connected component or a piece dies or when a whole dies. And so you should view a whole as a political desert that has 3 polling sites involved, and a piece as a political desert that has 2 polling sites involved. And differently from many applications, we care about the death time. We don't actually do the length death minus birth, which is common. We care about when it dies because that says how long it took to vote. Okay, so it's okay if I was born at 75. If I die at 90, it takes 90 to vote. Okay. And so basically having Atlanta farther to the right here means that there are more areas in Atlanta that took longer. Okay, so you don't want to be as far to the right. All right, we are working on parks in Chicago. One thing there that we're doing is called 2-parameter filtration because parks can have different qualities and we now care about that. We then lose some mathematical guarantees. And so this property of the system is now motivating what we do mathematically, but we don't have waiting times. Okay, so there's a paper in progress on this. And I will show the concluding slide since I know I'm running short on time. Okay, so topological data analysis can give insights into certain systems. I would not say that there is a killer app in the sense of where basically the way that I've been going about doing this saying, here's a system that has some feature that's where topology seems like a reasonable way to do it. What can I learn by doing that? Right. So I'm not guaranteeing that you cannot look at the system some other way and all that, but this is just the approach I've been taking. We've been doing systems that live in low literal dimensions, and that's allowed us to kind of get a little farther on certain comparisons. And we've been doing spatial ones where we've been incorporating features of the system into our approach, as opposed to just doing the standard methods. The Vietoris-Rips is the standard one, but we've been playing around with how we do these constructions, and we've been doing that on purpose. Yeah, that's where I want to end. So thank you so much. Yeah.
That was really interesting. It's like a lot of these questions are really
Yeah, maybe we start. Yeah,
I think you mentioned before that a lot of the
the quality of the data is really key because these, you might be doing community detection on a network that is assumed to be fully observed. But
Sure.
I was wondering, like, is there a way to sort of turn this around and sort of, if you have some, persistent homology that turns out to be really interesting, sort of using that as some sort of prior, like in a generative context, where you
Okay.
might be doing infilling or something like that.
Okay. I'll comment a bit. I don't know if that's hit the application so far, but there are generative models for it would be generative models for simplicial complexes, and there are ones that generalize various well-known models from networks. So for instance, there's something in networks called a configuration model, and in turn, there are configuration models for simplicial complexes. The work that I have seen with that has been at the level mostly of proving theorems for them. So it's not even been mostly an applied math work. It's been mostly theorem proof. What I have not seen is those things subsequently used for, say, statistical inference. So imagine if there were, and there should be a way to construct it, but I've not seen it, a simplicial complex analog of a stochastic block model that you then use for inference.
Sure, a block model.
I've
yeah.
never seen anybody take the
Yeah.
step of using it for inference. It's been more like, let's study these random models for its own sake, because these are people who come from kind of random topology, right? So there's been math papers that come up with generative models, but I have not seen the inference step taken. That is a worthwhile step. I will say that most of those papers are not the easiest to read. They're sort of written for people who already know certain mathematical language, but I do agree with the, I guess, implied comment that one should be able to do a sort of generative and inferential thing from that approach. I've just never seen it.
Oh, cool.
And just out of curiosity, I think you studied, like based on the like series of iterations, like studied the pieces and the holes, like when their burst time and death time is, and how long they persist. I'm just curious, like whether there could be more features or more complicated features than pieces and holes, and what that may, I guess, like mean in the real world.
Yeah, so I can comment on that. So if you're actually constructing these things, those pieces certainly exist mathematically. What happens is that remember I was mentioning about fast algorithms, the more higher dimensional pieces or higher dimensional objects that I consider, the slower the algorithms take, because they scale with the dimensionality there, and that scaling will start getting bad. So I have seen people do the two-dimensional one. Those are known as like two-dimensional voids, like a spherical shell. I have seen people do that in some cases. I would have to look up which papers actually did that. And so, yes, those are very relevant, but you start getting into serious problems on computational complexity when you do that. And so I have actually purposely been concentrating on projects where I've learned stuff from the lower dimensional versions of that, because that allowed me computationally to go farther. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. Yeah, Mark. I can always repeat the question if the mark doesn't land fast enough, but there's actually an excuse for me to have a cookie.
You mentioned that your distance measure doesn't need to be metric. Is it possible to have a non-metric space, especially if it violates the triangle inequality, that would break the nestedness of your simplicial complexes?
Right. So the stuff that I've done keeps it by construction. The stuff that I've done keeps it by construction. You do need something that's distance-like, but you could, for instance, do something asymmetric and have a divergence, for instance, instead of a distance. But what will not satisfy the triangle inequality is the distance matrix you get of the pairwise distances. So so this won't break the nestedness, but it breaks other things. So the reason I made the comment is that I don't literally have a metric space, but I basically have, I think mathematically it would be called a pseudo-metric space or something. But the type of thing that would, trying to think if there's a way to, okay, so I think that we make choices that don't break that. I'm trying to think of, if somebody were not careful, if it would break it. I am less sure about that answer to the question. A thing that breaks the nestedness, and there are actually generalizations of these. So zigzag persistence is the name of one generalization. If I thought of a network that changes in time, and I have edges coming in and like leaving and entering, that's something that would break nestedness, right? Whereas if I had a strictly growing network, I'm not going to break nestedness. And a measure that I do later with distance, that's distance-like, but not literally a metric, doesn't, because it's occurring later in the pipeline, it's not causing those problems. So I don't know if that's a complete answer to your question, but maybe partial at least.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
It was really great to have you.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, thanks.